Hi there, I'm Jeff Selingo, and I'm really thrilled to be joining you at the ASU GSV conference virtually this year. I'm the author of the new book called Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions. I'm also a special advisor at Arizona State University to President Michael Crow. I've been in and around higher education for more than 20 years, most of that time at the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I was the editor, and since then writing for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, among other outlets. I'm really pleased to welcome today Dan Greenstein, who's Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, also known as PASHE. Dan, it's great to have you with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Jeff, and congratulations on the new book.
Thanks, Dan. So one thing that people may not know about me is I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, not too far from Joe Biden country up there in Scranton, and Hillary Clinton. I guess a lot of politicians seem to be from the Scranton area. So I know a lot about PASHE as a result. I also covered PASHE, the state system of higher education there in Pennsylvania when I was a reporter at the Chronicle. So I'm really familiar with the issues that you face, but not only you face in Pennsylvania, but many other public university systems as well that grew up in similar ways, started as teachers' colleges and normal schools, evolved into regional public universities, comprehensive regional public universities, usually in the 1960s, grew since then, obviously, but now changing demographics and obviously the pandemic and state budgets are really changing the relationship many of your institutions have with their states, with their governments, and with their students. So Dan, could you describe a little bit first about what you faced when you got there? As many people know, you came to Pennsylvania from the Gates Foundation. What did you face when you came to the PASHE system?
Yeah, sure. So I arrived in September 2018, and discovered a system which is facing all the challenges which are familiar in public higher education. They're just very acute here in Pennsylvania. Briefly, declining public funding. Pennsylvania is 47th in the nation in terms of funding for public higher education, leads to tuition increases, which put downward pressure on enrollments, which are hard to get in a state which is crowded with colleges and universities, and which is experiencing a demographic decline. So by the time I got here, I think we had lost about 20% of our enrollments since 2010. And we had not sized the university accordingly. We hadn't sort of contracted in a way that would, so there was a number of financial challenges. The second issue, and again, common across public higher education, is that we're constantly racing to evolve in order to keep up with changing demand amongst our students, our employers. There's higher demand for short course certificates, more workforce aligned programming. There's higher demand for online learning for undergraduates as well as graduates. And we had been relatively, although we had some footprint in each of those areas, relatively slow to keep up. So the mission, and it was really driven by the board at that stage, was to evolve in both of those areas.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you approach then this challenge ahead of you? Because many people in your position are in the same position when they arrive at these chancellorship positions. But then, you have all of these individual universities and individual towns across the state. They all have state lawmakers who are associated with them, alums, faculty, all the usual things. And now you're at a system level. So how did you approach what you then had to do to get the system right-sized?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. First of all, the case for change had already been made in general terms. After about a decade or more of recession management, I know people feel the sense of urgency. And there's a sense that whatever we do going forward, it can't be a lot like what happened in the past because it's just not working all that well for us. So I think that was a good thing insofar as it created a platform, a general platform of understanding both in the General Assembly, but also amongst constituencies within and around the university that things had to change. In fact, the board had gone out to hire a change agent in order to lead what it called a system redesign. So that was good. The bigger challenge was then aligning around the dimensions of the problems that we face, which is really a data problem and a trust in the data problem on the one hand, and then to align around the path forward. And actually, we started with the data, right, where there was a general distrust about the dimensions of the problem that we faced. And so that was just a matter of, I think we called it radical transparency, just opening up the books. And if people wanted to debate the methodologies in which, budgets were forecast or student outcomes were evaluated and assessed, that was fine, because you could look at the data and oh my goodness, this is a problem no matter which way you actually assess it. And so we went through a process where we had a very kind of open set of conversations around how we evaluate our circumstances. And then as we resolved the methods and the approaches and built some trust in the processes, we just started to expose the information pretty publicly, both through public testimony in the General Assemblies and through widespread tours of the universities, open fora, et cetera. So that was the sort of the way in, was through the data and the analysis of them, so that we could at least see where we are.
So trying to come to this common set of understanding by all parties involved. Did that take longer than you expected? Did once that data, as you say, was exposed to the wider world, people said, "Oh, now I get it," or did it still require more push?
No, I think the data. So you're gonna have to excuse me, because I just realized that my plug is not in and my battery is running low. Back. Goodness, the things we do in our world. Hold on a second. Yeah. So no, I didn't think it did not take as long as I expected. I think the broader, the longer term, what took longer was to really craft a way forward.
Okay.
And this was, there was a number of dimensions. So, let me start with the General Assembly. So in the General Assembly, really the discussion was public higher education is a partnership. It's a partnership between, the public systems in our case, and its universities, and the General Assembly. Our job is to manage effectively, to be responsive to the evolving needs of the state. The General Assembly's job is obviously to support us in that. And what we discovered there was that the two parties, as it were, we're talking, two parties, the system and the General Assembly, we're talking past each other. The General Assembly had a number of needs about, efficiency, effectiveness, greater responsiveness to evolving student needs, et cetera. And we had been talking to the General Assembly about give us more money, right? And it wasn't really a dialogue; it was a dialogue that crossed past each other. And so that was really a matter of just spending a lot of time in the Capitol building, meeting with people individually, meeting with people in small groups, meeting with different segments of parties and the leadership, and spending a lot of time with the governor's office and his staff, trying to sort of build a common understanding of what that partnership might look like, and listening, frankly, to what members of the governor's office and the General Assembly were saying to us, what were their needs of the state systems. Now, that was sort of one big important part of the package, because it was critical to generating the trust on the part of the General Assembly in the board and the Chancellor.
In other words, that they felt that you were listening to them. That's what they wanted.
Correct.
What were among their needs? You talked about efficiency. Was it really around kind of how the system operated, or was it more than that?
Yeah, I think it was more than that. The things that I heard were accountability. Right, we don't actually believe what you're telling us. The numbers change. There's never a story. We don't see you very often around the Capitol building. You're never here. Come talk to us. So there was a kind of, and we responded to that through our appropriations process. We built an accountability dashboard. We showed our data, warts and all. We were not afraid of talking about our problems, and I think that helped. The second thing was, efficiency. Our enrollments had declined by 20%. Our overall headcount had declined by 10%. And it's hard to sort of justify, continued asks for funding when you're seen to have that level of, overspend. And I think there was also a sense of responsiveness. There was really no understanding that the system already had been acting very effectively to align its programming, its degree programming, so that it did meet, evolving workforce needs in STEM and health and business, but that wasn't visible, right? So really having these dialogue that really focused on these three areas, and being open to disclosing what our real challenges were, and so working with folks and getting their input onto how we might face them.
So let's talk a little bit about the actual plan. So you went through a planning process. You've come out with a plan. Could you talk about that maybe at a high level? And how did you get to that plan?
Yeah, so obviously the two fundamental components, financial stabilization on the one hand, absolutely critical. We have, when I got here, we had one university in insolvency, and several facing it. Now the situation has obviously gotten a little bit more complicated and a little bit worse. So putting a plan together to actually to face those financial challenges, the full range of things, Jeff. Right sizing the institution, implementing shared services so that we weren't redundantly doing everything, not just shared services in the back office, payroll, let's say HR, et cetera, but shared services in the front office. Shared academic programming. It isn't necessary to have 14 schools of Celtic poetry when that can be spread more. The access to those kinds of programs and choose Celtic poetry because simply it's my favorite. But it could be fill in your subject area. So sharing academic programming, shared services, restructuring our debt, beginning to think about how we right size the institution in terms of its headcount. So that was a financial stabilization plan. And then there was a series of initiatives that were intended to help us innovate in ways which would not only serve the people of the state better, but introduce tried and tested practices that are known to serve the kinds of students that we serve better in developmental education, supplemental education, student advising, and health and wellness support, et cetera. Just adopting good practice as it was emerging across the industry in our system, and enabling us to serve better populations that have been underserved. So we're kind of working along those two tracks. I have to say that the most important component, and I didn't really know this coming in, was putting together an accountability structure, right? Because if you're wanting to initiate change, you have to be able to hold individuals and institutions accountable for their behavior. Right?
In other words, just reporting on what you're doing is not good enough. That's not accountability.
Correct. And I think as we introduced the accountability framework, and it was really taking a leaf out of the book that Margaret Spellings really began to prepare in 2003, what we recognized was that dashboard reporting was important because it demonstrated the dimensions of the problem. You could build trust and coalesce around some of the challenges that we faced, but it wasn't adequate, right? You had to be able to hold individuals and institutions accountable for bad decisions or decisions that had unfortunate outcomes, whether with respect to student outcomes or with respect to financial outcomes. And so putting in place an accountability structure and a budgeting process, which you're never going to sort of mitigate against bad decisions being made or decisions being made which have bad financial outcomes, for example. But you can in fact put in place some structures which ensure that there is accountability when that happens. And so that's really where we got to. And that has proved to be critically important in sort of driving the agenda for change, giving sort of visibility into the goals and aspirations of universities, and at the same time looking at their performance against those goals and having some structures in place which hold them accountable for those performances.
Okay. So in terms of the actual plan then, some consolidation, and how did that change, or did it change because of the pandemic?
So the pandemic did not do very much to help our financial circumstances, as you can imagine. And so, as it sort of the impacts of the pandemic unfolded, I realized, gosh, I'm really glad we had a 2-year head start on this, because, God, I would hate to be starting at square one, immediately in response. So, as far as I could see, and really where we are today is the pandemic has accelerated our work in each of these areas, both in terms of financial stabilization, but also in terms of, introducing new approaches to learning, new approaches to student services, and trying to reach into new markets through online and sort of online programming on the one hand and workforce aligned programming on the others. All of those areas which we had begun to make progress, slowly in some areas, more quickly in others, just picked up the pace.
And so, Dan, could you give us at a high level some of any of the particulars of
Sure.
Of what you're planning to do or hoping to do?
Yeah. So, let's look at on the financial stabilization, that's a playbook, right? You just have to sort of align your costs with your expenditures. I mean, not pleasant, not pretty, but we'll get through it. And we'll get through it in a way which will, I think, leave our universities very, very capable in probably serving their students even better. In terms of the integration of new approaches, what we're trying there is to integrate a handful of our universities, 3 in the North region, Lockheed, Mansfield, and Bloom, creating a single accredited entity from what is now 3 independently accredited entities, and 3 in the West, Clarion, Edinburgh, and California. Using those, of course, when you integrate universities, you achieve a higher level of operating scale, and using those scale efficiencies to develop those institutions. They'll continue to do what they do in more traditional residentially based education, but also stand them up as statewide hubs branching into new markets. In the West, creating a statewide hub that's enabling us to do fully online undergraduate degree and degree completion programs. And in the North, really looking at whether we can leverage the capabilities there and the demands of industry, frankly, in order to incrementally stand up a statewide hub doing non-degree credentialing in addition to in addition to the more traditional stuff. So using those integrations to drive innovation. And of course, those other piece part innovations, advising reform, student retention oriented work, taking place across all of the 14. Those would be in the category of innovation.
What have you found the biggest hurdles to integration are? Because this to me is probably what is facing many other states as well. And as you know, the whole idea of mergers and acquisitions, people don't want to go that far. You're calling this an integration. I think that's a term that you're using in particular. So could you describe why you're using that term and what are the hurdles, or why is that easier, and what are the hurdles still to overcome on that front?
Let me start with the hurdles. The biggest hurdle that we faced was the board did not have the authority to integrate universities. So
which is amazing, right?
Statute. And so we actually had to drive a legislative agenda, which resulted in Act 50, which was passed in June 2020, which gave the board that authority. And that, of course, was leveraging that sort of sense of partnership and trust that we had built within the General Assembly in order to build a coalition in favor of that kind of reform legislation, which passed in June. There are 250 votes together in the Senate and the House of Representatives in the Commonwealth, and we got 247 in favor. So that was a reflection of that sort of that trust building work. I think the other big obstacle is that integration is seen as a kind of a penalty or a punishment when it's actually an opportunity and an honor.
To do something new.
Yeah, it's how do we destigmatize? Here is an opportunity to achieve at some scale, to leverage operating scale in order to do new, to redesign, public higher education, which is known to be challenged, if not failing, so that it is lasting into the 21st century. How many people get that opportunity? Very few. Right. And it's really interesting. These are conversations on the ground with faculty and staff and administrators. And it's an emotional journey. And you watch it in people's faces, and you go from the kind of, oh my God, this is horrible. And 120 or 150 years of history is about to dissolve in front of you, to this sense of excitement. We can build, we can do new, we can reimagine our program, we can put the student at the center for the first time, maybe. Again, at least in 150 years, and reconstruct. So bringing people along in that journey and being sensitive to the kind of, and acknowledging the emotional component of it, I think has been one of the bigger challenges.
I mean, Dan, is part of the problem here? Obviously, people's jobs are at stake, their careers, their futures, but these institutions, not only in Pennsylvania, but across the country, are really highly identified with their communities, much like community colleges are, right? They grew up in those communities. Sometimes they even take on the names of those communities. And now in this age, they are the largest, usually job center, cultural center. They're the hub of these towns, right?
Yeah.
So much of their identity is caught up in them, correct?
Yeah, and I think, with respect to that, obviously the universities that we're looking at integrating, with the exception of Bloomsburg, are pretty seriously challenged financially. And they are, each of our universities is surrounded by a politically appointed council of trustees. As you know, but the trustees very much represent the kind of local community. And the councils of trustees on the whole, look, we've been doing recession management for over a dozen years. There is nothing left to cut, right? And the future of, you can only go, where that ends, right? We saw where it ends with, with Cheney, but with others nationally, is eventually you're unable to balance your budgets, which means you exhaust your reserves, which means you go into negative cash flow on an annual basis. The accreditors come in, things become problems. It's an insoluble problem, right? And I think that, generally that trajectory is well seen. And so it is possible to get, and you're right, it is possible to get communities, I believe, to rally round, because you're actually talking about saving institutions through reconstruction. We are specifically not talking about closure. You asked about why we use the word integration. Mergers has a bad name, and closure is not possible. It's not actually in the legislation. It's not in the board's authority. Only the General Assembly can close an institution. It would be a horrible thing to do anyway. So we say, look, we're going to work together to create something new. At the end of the day, this is not about getting smaller. This is about stabilizing ourselves financially so that we can grow. There are jobs, right, in the out years. And that's what we're looking at. And we're enlisting support. It's very early days at the stage, but enlisting support from the community, from the alumni, as well as from the internal constituencies in crafting what that future looks like.
So Dan, as you talk to your counterparts across the country in similar jobs who are facing similar issues, they all got here in many of the same ways, right? You were talking about this decline in enrollment, but yet appropriations were continuing kind of to hum along. People were reporting numbers and accountability measures and things like that, but there wasn't true accountability. Like, did it take the pandemic to really say, okay, we really need to do something about this? Obviously, you were already starting down that road anyway, but what took so long?
Yeah, I'll tell you, the only thing I was in during the Great Recession, probably you as well. Just, the Great Recession is going to be a big tipping point. Yeah. It's going to be such disruption.
But it didn't happen.
And then there was one before that, right? When did Global Crossing go under? 2002 or whatever the .com bust was. There was another one. We're all waiting, So when are things going to get bad enough?
But so do you think that this might be that tipping point? Truly?
I don't actually know. I mean, maybe, potentially not. I mean, I'm beginning to see a kind of relaxation on the faces of my peers and counterparts across the country to a certain extent. No, we can get through this too, right? I'm glad we got started before, Jeff. Okay. The case for change was made before the pandemic. Look, I mean, I think the other thing is it's about trust. I think institutions which are seen as being sort of responding in a knee-jerk fashion to a sort of exogenous circumstances like the pandemic may have more difficulty generating trust amongst their various constituencies. But we had built the case for change over years, well before I got here. And really, my getting here was about articulating the direction of change, not making the case in order to have to do it. So I think that's been helpful. And I think the pandemic has been an accelerator. I think it's enabled us to realize, the shared services thing. I mean, we don't actually need to be in the building in many of our functions. We can do things in different ways. We can actually shift within 2 or 3 weeks. It gives us a sense of confidence in our own agility in some of the kinds of things we're trying to do. So I think that will act as an accelerant as well. But I don't know that it will be that sort of defining watershed moment for the broader industry. We'll see.
Okay, so the title of this session was around system change. You had talked about the case for change in some ways was already made by the time you got there. Yeah. Now you're really focused on the direction for change. You talked about some of those things, accountability, obviously shared services. Can we dig a little bit deeper on what else needs to change in systems like this? You can talk about your own system or in general. What needs to change? So shared services seems like low-hanging fruit to me. So obviously there is a low-hanging fruit that you have to take, but what else needs to change in these systems?
So I think in the shared services, with the accountability, I think each of the areas that we've been sort of innovating, we're basically adopting existing playbooks and then seeing how to revise them. With accountability, we did dashboard reporting, realized that's not enough. You actually have to put an accountability structure that holds individuals accountable for actions, right? With shared services, realized, there's a shared services playbook, but you can't keep it in the back office. You have to do shared academic programming. Not every school can teach nursing, right? It's just they're going to cannibalize each other, and they're going to cannibalize the surrounding. Better to sort of aggregate up and be more powerful in a very competitive marketplace through that aggregation. So that requires a kind of a systemic approach to sort of academic planning. With innovation, with an innovation agenda, whether you're looking at advising or developmental education, we cannot afford the kind of, hey, let's pilot it at every single institution and see what works, right? We have to take a more disciplined approach. So we've been sort of modifying the kind of the standard playbooks and demonstrating where they fall short. I think 2 areas have come out to me which I hadn't accounted for. Both of them culturally. So one of them is that our organizations are really hierarchical. I mean, if you think about higher education, it's incredible because if you think about academic, the way we approach the academic program and the authorities we devolve to faculty. It's sort of a sort of more of an anarchical kind of approach to governance. And yet, despite that, right, where individuals are so concerned and have so much authority over what they're teaching, and yet the structure the container we put the academic process in is rigidly hierarchical. And so as a result, people are always looking up for direction. So how do you, and if you look at the sort of trends in industry, about having to do with innovation and growth. It's all
It's
about
called from the bottom.
evolving,
Yeah.
right? Creating and empowering teams, getting decision making down to the ground. It's like, oh my goodness, how do you do that in higher education without striking fear into the hearts of every administrator? So I think that's been one challenge. And then communication has been another challenge, because of our hierarchy, we communicate down, not very much up. How do we actually sort of ensure a greater degree of openness in our communication, a network effect in communication? And those are kind of structural issues as well as kind of a cultural and organizational ones, which I think are going to need a lot of attention over.
So, Dan, because we're at ASU GSV, and I wish we were all together in San Diego right now, especially as the fall has come east to both of us. But what's interesting to me is obviously, as you know, from ASU GSV, you have a lot of funders in the room from not only the philanthropies and the foundations, but other private funders, big companies, as well as entrepreneurs, who are all trying to solve the problems you're trying to solve for too. And they look at a system like Pennsylvania or any state system like that, and they say, oh, scale, right? We could get to scale. And so you think, well, we come up with one solution and we scale it. We come up with another solution and we scale it. But that sounds easier than it's actually done, correct, at the state level. What are you finding now as you start to really dig into this whole scale issue? Because we know that's how you drive a lot of change in higher education, if you could get to that scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was sort of getting it in the last sort of last answer, I guess. The real challenges have to do with change management and change leadership, and just the relatively limited capability that we have inside the industry for doing those sorts of things. And it doesn't really matter how innovative, any number of, you may have innovative leaders both in the faculty and in the administration, but unless you have a kind of general facility and support for change management and innovation, it's super hard. I'm not sure our talent development structures are put in place in a way that allows us to reward and incentivize behaviors that we want to see incentivized if you're going to be empowering individuals closer to the ground to do really cool work.
Because that's a risk they don't want to take all the time, right?
How do you reward that? Our reward structures are very hierarchical. They tend to be in some ways sort of rote and elevator-like, insofar as the tenure, process amongst faculty and the sort of promotion process amongst staff. So, I think it's going to require a lot of adjustment in the talent development, HR back end, in order to support the kind of transformation we're looking for. It's not enough, at least in my view, to have, hey, I know how to do X. Look, there's an evidence base under, name your intervention. You have to till the soil of the institution in order to plant that seed and have it grow. And that is an area where I think some additional thinking and support would be very valuable.
What else do you need at this point to really kind of continue to drive that change forward? Is it external to the state? You talked about, building that trust with the legislature, which you now seem to have, right? You talked about the legislation you were able to get. You now have this plan in place, or this plan, starting to go into place. What else do you feel like you need at this point to continue to drive? I mean, is there a point where something might get stuck because you're missing it?
The number of failure points across the next 2 years are just almost uncountable. So the facetious answer, of course, is cloning. There's a handful of leaders, and leaders exist at all levels of an organization, and there are a great number, many of them here. And how do we clone them? And that's actually not facetious with respect to the scientific act of cloning. It's how do you actually build a cadre of artisans and help them and support them in the change leadership roles that are going to be required. I think that's one of the bigger and that's sort of a talent development. It's a change leadership, change communication type activity. I think that's going to be important. I think developing the communication structures that allow us to move at the rate and pace we need to move, but honor the traditions of shared governance, not just with faculty, but with council of trustees and with other constituencies. I think that's going to be a challenge to us. How do you create inclusive processes that work at speed? We don't have time. Our financial circumstances are that severe that time is really our enemy. And so speed and pace is essential. And yet speed and pace really puts pressure on the fabric of our organizations and their culture. I think, keeping tight alignment with the presidents really work together with me very closely. They are my sort of brain trust and strategy team. And, it just takes a huge amount of time. We meet 4 hours a week, twice a week for 2 hours at a time. It's an enormous amount of time to take out of a CEO's schedule. And yet it's absolutely essential. And we're going to have to expand the net to include other leaders. So how do we free that time so that we can spend the time that we need to spend with each other? And I would say the same thing about, colleagues in our collective bargaining agreements. How do we ensure that leadership has adequate time to engage in these kinds of consultation processes? Those are some of the challenges I think we face, which are sort of structural and probably within our gift to influence. There are plenty of others out there which are well beyond our means of control.
So Dan, I want to dive back into a little bit of the particulars again about some of the stuff that you mentioned these institutions are going to be doing going forward. And I talked in the beginning about the involvement of the evolution of institutions like the ones that you lead, right? These were normal schools, teachers, colleges, then became comprehensive universities, and then they exploded from there in terms of like serving everybody on everything, undergraduate, graduate, professional programs, and so forth. And that became part of their issue and their problem as well, because they were also occupying this space in higher education between and I know that not all the institutions love these terms, right? But between the flagships and the community colleges. Going forward, does this really require more differentiation of these institutions? You mentioned that they're not going to necessarily do everything, and they're going to do some new things, shorter programs, focusing on degree completion, focusing on online, but they're not going to have to do everything. And when you say everything, we're not just talking about academic programs here, but we're also talking about the mode of delivery and the students they're serving and things like that.
Yeah, no, I think it has to. And I think that's the hardest thing. Look, the hardest thing to do within a university is to make choices, right? But at least when you're talking about within the university, you're going up to a single CEO, usually in a board, and those choices, hard as they may be, they can be made. Now you're talking about making those kinds of choices, but at the system level.
Yeah.
And system structures weren't built to make choice. They were built, the system structures were built as compliance and regulatory organizations and interfaces with the General Assembly and mechanisms for distributing public money. They were not set up, and that whole accountability structure was revising the policy structure so that we could make choice, right, and system choice. So I think that is, critical going forward. Look, I think the other thing which has happened within this sector, it's not just the, actually it's really important to talk about the success of the sector. The explosion of the sector represents the kind of demand that it was serving for so long, so successfully, quite honestly. The challenge is over the last sort of dozen years or so is that the sector had acted mostly with low and middle income students and was affordable relative to the next sort of tier. And that affordability advantage hasn't evaporated entirely, but it's shrunk.
Yeah.
And so now you're looking, okay, so what do you got, right? If you're no longer $8,000 or $9,000 cheaper than the next possible option, where's the value proposition? And I think that's something that we're going to have to struggle with, not just here, but across the differentiation by price as well as by function.
And Dan, that's really important because these were really known as access institutions, right? Obviously, just rung above. And again, I know people don't love these terms, but there were the two-year college sector, the community colleges, which were obviously high access institutions, but so were your institutions, mostly drawing students within 100 miles of their home base. And if you lose that affordability piece, where do those students go?
Right. No, exactly. They will go somewhere, but the cost that they're going to pay, the total cost they're going to pay for their education is going to be much higher than it would have been. And that's it. To me, that is what's sad, because you've lost, or we're losing that public option, the value of which was that it was pervasive and it was affordable. Right. I mean, you're already seeing differentiation within the system. Several of our universities, are going to break out into that sort of master's level, even graduate research level kind of, and will succeed there. Others are focusing more on the baccalaureate and creating sort of niches for themselves. So you're already beginning to see that differentiation happening internally. But it will need to accelerate. Broadly speaking, there's that isomorphism that Michael Crow talks about in his first book.
So, what advice do you have for your counterparts across the country, and for, by the way, those watching us today at ASU GSV?
Yeah,
A
yeah.
combination of funders on various levels, policymakers, as well as entrepreneurs and big companies trying to disrupt higher education. What advice, first of all, do you have for your counterparts? Then we'll go to
Yeah.
that group that's watching us today, probably.
Yeah, the counterparts, my fellow CEOs, there's a whole bunch of us now who are experiencing these kinds of challenges, actually, and focusing on many of the same things, including university integration. Resilience is absolutely critical. Keeping your sense of humor and not taking any of this stuff personally, but sort of adhering to the mission. It's easy for me to do because you get up in the morning and genuinely you do the hard work because it's too important to not try, right? And I think that's actually important to be able to have that level of commitment, but also objectivity. I think to policymakers, I think we've demonstrated in Pennsylvania that you can actually have a different kind of dialogue. Even in these very divisive times. Education is very much about workforce development and social mobility, and those are two concepts which are critical both sides of the aisle. They're critical in different ways. Social mobility is something which affects rural as well as urban regions, and so can weld people together in a way that I hadn't expected. And I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us to figure out how to work together to find a common language that we can use to identify solutions that we can coalesce behind. Because at the end of the day, they are the kinds of solutions which are going to require the mobilization of public resources, taxpayer dollars. The only way through this is to reconsider and to redraft the compact between the public and the public sector, the governments at federal and state level, and public higher education. So that's going to be a lift in very divided political times, but I believe it's possible. And I believe that the data and the dialogue really sort of point that way. I shouldn't say this at ASU GSV because I'm in Harrisburg and not in San Diego. I think we got to stop talking about disruption.
Okay.
There are people here. They have lives. They live in communities, right? They have jobs and aspirations, and they have hopes and dreams and families. And nobody wants to be disrupted. And we're not. They didn't sign up to sort of be on the roller coaster of disruption. They signed up to help people. You don't work in this industry if you're a if you're a misanthrope, right? You just don't. And so, why not appeal to that? This is not going to be driven by exogenous forces somehow parachuting in, and we're going to fix you. It's going to be fixed internally or through some kind of combination. So the kind of partnership that we're pursuing in the policy arena, we should be also pursuing with our providers, our suppliers, our vendors, and in most cases, with most of the large organizations that I work with, that's the case. But the conversation is around partnership, not we're going to fix it, we're going to disrupt you.
So Dan, one last question I want to
never
bring
be invited back.
One last question I want to bring back to the personal level here. You talked earlier about leadership, and I want you to reflect quickly on your own leadership, because you are both an academic, but you didn't come up through the traditional way that probably previous chancellors of that system and many systems do, right? They teach in the system. They're usually a provost or vice president somewhere within that system or another system like it. You didn't travel that path there. Do you feel like that's been helpful? And when you talk about these leaders in the future, both at the campus level and at the system level, where are they going to have to come from?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I do think it's important to have some insider knowledge of the industry. It does have its own characteristics and culture. And I don't necessarily think it's necessary to have that in the CEO, but I do think it's necessary to have it around the CEO if it's not in the CEO. And so I think of leadership in terms of teams. And so, really it's not, obviously the individual leader is important, but can the leaders surround themselves with people who then provide the complementary skills that are necessary to move a kind of change agenda? I think that's going to be critical, and that's going to require a degree of awareness. Again, in our hierarchy, what's been important to me is being able to listen to folks and being able to, invite feedback and be able to hear that, when people say, look, you're wrong, you need to move in another direction, and be responsive to that. I value that kind of input, and I value having around me the kind of people who will give me that. And but whether it's my presidents or our union leadership or members of our board, it's absolutely critical. And it's not necessarily something that is inviting, but if we're going to build a kind of, look, this isn't going to be driven top down. No, it can't be. It's just not the way any organization, at least in higher ed, works. It has to be driven through some kind of coalition. And coalition building is itself a skill, which at least I'm sort of, I guess, not very good at learning through trial and error, probably more error and trial than successes. But it's critical in this kind of work.
Well, Dan Greenstein from Pennsylvania Higher Education, State System of Higher Education, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank all of you for joining us as well.
Jeff, thanks.
Have a good one. Thank you, Dan.
Bye.
Look away, and now present.